All right, this is Lecture 9, Road to Revolution, Part 1. The very nature of the American colonies was going to lend itself to having a different type of society from Europe. As it points out down here, the idea of self-sufficiency, the idea of what you can do for yourself, it won't come from any sort of societal hierarchy, right, that it talks about in Europe. Remember, the big idea coming into the New World was going back to a republican form of government, right, where there's going to be a lot of emphasis on the citizen, and then the citizen developing these core virtues, right? The idea of being selfless courage, an appetite for involvement. Society works when people are involved. If you go back to the Greeks and Romans and that kind of stuff, you'll see that they started to fail when people became more concerned about their sort of selfish desires or personal desires than the greater of the common good. We're going to see the introduction of the Whig Party. Basically, the Whig Party was the political party in England that did not support the king. As it says right here, they were worried about threats to their liberty because of the monarch. Eventually, we'll see a party take this name in the United States because they'll be against Andrew Jackson. So not only fearing the power of the king, but also this idea that they had become accustomed to running their own stuff, the colonies, right, are going to embrace that idea of salutary neglect like we discussed in class, and also the idea that this distance, right, it took weeks for information to get back and forth, so there wasn't like any direct control until we start to see the influence of more and more British presence in the colonies, which will cause more and more resentment. We talked about mercantilism in class, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, right? The basic idea that a mother country, right, was going to be able to amass gold and silver and raw materials through its colonies, right? The colonial colonies conferred distinct advantages, could supply raw materials to the mother country, could provide guaranteed markets for exports, and the big important thing, right, is this. London government viewed American colonies as tenants, right? We were there to work for them kind of idea. Remember, the idea of mercantilism was effectively put into play through the Navigation Acts. These were originally aimed at the Dutch that were working in the colonies and trading with the English colonists. And remember, the Navigation Acts had a series of things that things could only be shipped on British ships to British people at British ports. And remember, there was going to be a list of goods or enumerated goods that couldn't be shipped anywhere else. Now, another aspect of this, right, as I said, caused there to be a trade imbalance, and goods ended up currency ended up flowing out of the colony. So in return, right, the Americans were going to start to issue paper money, right? Now, Parliament is going to prohibit this paper currency. Now, the Crown reserved the right to veto things, realized that the colonists didn't mind so much obeying the Crown. It's when Parliament gets involved and the sort of British system at the time. They didn't necessarily think Parliament had much of a say about them because they saw themselves as basically royal defined, so a royal colony, so the king could make decisions but not necessarily Parliament. All in all, this British system, as it points out right here, may seem oppressive but was loosely enforced. So the Americans smuggled a lot and paid off customs officials and all that sort of stuff. And there were benefits of this, right? The payouts to the colonial producers of those raw materials was good, and the Royal Navy provided protection to U.S. shipping. The major downsides here, right, the colonists found it to be debasing, right? It made them to feel like they were, as it says right here, economic adolescents. They were always like the children of the other country. They couldn't do what they pleased, and at the same time, since they couldn't do what they pleased, it stifled this economic initiative, this idea of people going out and blazing their own path, which, as we pointed out at the beginning of the presentation, was one of those things that makes the colonies so different, right, compared to the stifling nature of the European system. So they didn't like the fact that they had to rely upon the British to do these things. They wanted to have their own economic initiative, their own free enterprise system, if you will, and kind of expand, but they were kind of locked in because of the British policies. So the next step in this growing resentment was going to be following the 7 Years' War. Remember, Britain came out on top. Their empire was now the largest, but they also had the largest debt to pay. And so the Prime Minister here, George Grenville, is basically going to now attempt to enforce the Navigation Acts. So the Sugar Act here, okay? Basically, there's a tax on sugar coming in from the Caribbean. And what's going to happen is they're not going to like the fact that they're having to pay this tax. Even though an agitation died down, they still weren't happy about it. What happened is they went from, let's say, like 5 pence a hogshead or a barrel to 2 pence. But they actually intended to collect it, and that was what was going to anger everybody. Because remember, they had been smuggling this in, paying off these customs officials, and now the customs officials were going to have to be held accountable, and people aren't going to be excited about that. Also, you're going to have the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act is going to require the colonies to provide food and quarters for British troops. Yet again, they were forced to live amongst the people. And so the resentment of having this British presence and then having to provide them food and board was also going to be disheartening. And, sometimes the soldiers didn't always have the best attitude, and there was confrontation that way as well. Now, in 1765, the Stamp Act, which we already watched a video on, but the main thing here was this Stamp Act was issued to provide security, and so the British didn't see it as a big problem. They thought the colonists were just going to be doing their part. The Stamp Act was going to be basically placed on all paper items, okay? And it was like an embossment of a stamp. And so if you bought a newspaper, you were a lawyer, you needed a receipt, or you bought a book or whatever. Okay, so stamps were required on bills of sale, right, as I just pointed out, of 50 different items. Grenville regarded the measure as reasonable, and people in England paid higher stamp taxes than they did in the colonies. And so, yet again, in England, this wasn't seen as a big deal. In the colonies, this is going to be a huge overstepping of the boundaries because, one, we don't have any representation in Parliament, and two, they're not going to see Parliament's right to actually be able to tax them. So these taxes are going to upset everyone, like I said. Not big fans of the Stamp Acts. The Quartering Act, right? I guess I kind of misspoke earlier, but what would happen is they would build barracks, and if they couldn't put them in the barracks, they would put them in, like it says, public houses, but effectively like inns, which were central to life in colonial America. Now, what's going to happen is that some people are going to refuse to comply. Those some people, namely, is going to be the colony of New York. In 1766, some 1,500 troops show up in New York, and they refuse to comply with the Quartering Act. And let me see if I can read it here. The troops had to remain on their ships with its great impact on the city. A skirmish occurred, which one colonist was wounded. In the end, England is going to basically suspend their colonial government until this gets taken care of. Now, a big part of this was this concept, admiralty courts. So if colonists did see this basically overstepping their rights and they fought back, they were tried in admiralty courts. And an admiralty court was a naval court. So it was like kind of like a court-martial type situation, like it was a military court, that you did not have a jury of your peers. And the reason they were trying them in these courts was because the colonists, as juries of their peers, would let off the people that were breaking these laws. So if you knew the guy that was the smuggler and he had brought stuff in for cheaper and people didn't see it as a big deal, they wouldn't punish them, or they would punish them very lightly. So the British didn't like that because they wanted to curb this behavior. So they tried them in these courts without juries, which yet again jeopardized their basic rights, they thought, as Englishmen. So yet again, the idea here that only colonial assembly should be able to tax colonists, namely because there were no Americans, right, in Parliament. Greenville is going to see this idea of virtual representation, right, that everybody was represented by Parliament, and that this is going to make people begin to second-guess themselves, right? This idea that Parliament had no authority, and then yet again this idea that they maybe could move towards political independence. So one of the major things they're going to do is they're going to form the Stamp Act Congress in 1765, right? And out of this Stamp Act Congress, we're going to see the idea of a boycott. So the non-importation agreement is going to be made. Agreements against importing British goods. We read about in class the ideas of women kind of picking up the slack on the importation of cloth. And as it says right here, it gave Americans new opportunities to participate in colonial protests. Interestingly enough, these teapots were made in England, and they came out after the repeal of the Stamp Act. And so it kind of is an interesting idea that these teapots were made in England and then sold in the colonies for profit about a law that was unpopular and created in England. So it just goes to show you the sort of conflicting nature of trade and policy in the colonial period. Besides the Stamp Act Congress, you're also going to have the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty also working to get the Stamp Act repealed. What's going to happen is they're going to harass officials. The women are going to provide alternatives to British cloth. And eventually, as it points out right here, the boycott is going to hurt the English economy. And so the Parliament will repeal the Stamp Act in 1766. Now, here's the famous picture of the Sons of Liberty here tarring and feathering a Stamp Act official. Now, in response to the Stamp Act repeal, Parliament is also going to pass what's referred to as the Declaratory Act. Remember, the outcry was because the colonists didn't truly believe that Parliament had the right to actually do this. So by passing the Declaratory Act, right, they're saying basically that the Parliament and King had the right to enforce laws on the colony. Now, eventually, Charles Townshend is going to be made the Chancellor of the Exchequer in England. The Chancellor of the Exchequer is like the head of the Treasury. And he wants to put a light import duty on glass, white lead, paper, paint, and tea. Right? Now, it's an indirect custom, so you're not necessarily paying it directly to the government. But yet again, it's another tax that's going to be levied to help pay for the soldiers and that kind of thing. As it points out here on the slide, it would also help pay for the royal governor. And so the idea was maybe the governor could make these taxes higher or do whatever, so there was too much of maybe a conflict of interest there for the colonists. The Non-Importation Agreement and the Townshend Acts, or the Non-Importation Agreement was renewed, as it says. The Townshend Acts were a little bit less volatile initially as the Stamp Act, so the colonists, as it says right there, took the light new tax less seriously. They figured out ways to smuggle stuff around it, but what's going to happen is the British are going to escalate this situation by landing 2 regiments of troops in Boston, which we will look at this in more detail in class, will lead to the Boston Massacre. Famous picture here, the engraving by Paul Revere. Yet again, I said we'll break this down in class. Everybody's favorite point right here is the dog. A sort of more detailed picture. So although the Townshend Acts were not popular, right, back in England, George III was, as it says right there, attempting to assert the power of the monarchy. He didn't really have the best people around him, namely his Prime Minister, Lord North. What's also going to happen is that money that they're generating really wasn't enough because the colonists were smuggling, remember? It did, though, as it says there, caused any rebellion, and in turn, right, it caused that non-importation agreement to be back in effect, which was hurting the English economy. Now, they're going to repeal the Townshend Acts. Okay, I've seen this before. Sam Adams, fired up as always, is going to basically continue his campaign, if you will, to harass the British officials. Remember, they're still trying to enforce the navigation laws, which the colonists don't really like. And we're also going to see the creation of the Committee of Correspondence. Okay, Committee of Correspondence is really like an organization that today would send emails back and forth, but back then they wrote letters to keep one another abreast of the situation that was going on. So each colony kind of set up their own committees, and they would communicate with one another. Famous picture of Sam Adams. I've already mentioned a lot of this information, right? They set these up in other colonies. They played a key role in stimulating and disseminating information, right? So the lead up here to the Tea Party, okay, the British East India Company had 17 million pounds of unsold tea. To get rid of that, the British government is going to allow them a monopoly, so they're not going to have to pay the tax on the tea, and so they're going to be able to sell their tea cheaper than the other tea that's already in the colony. So the colonists are not going to be, the British are actually thinking, well, this will be good, they'll be able to get this cheap tea that'll make everybody happy. But the colonists spin this in a way that makes them upset, because in actuality, right, you're a merchant trying to sell your tea, you're not going to compete with this tax-free tea, right? Also, guys like Sam Adams and them, right, are going to stir up people in this idea, as it says right here, to trick them into accepting taxes. So anything they're going to do at this point is going to be received with a negative connotation. So all over the colonies, right, people are going to fight back against. Only did Boston official refused to be cowed, and Governor Hutchinson, who we've already read about, right, refused to budge, which is so the growing tension in Boston, right? Hutchinson is going to infuriate the Boston radicals because he's not going to basically allow them to push him around. So the tea ships are not going to be allowed to leave Boston until they've unloaded their cargo. So in the middle of the night on December 16th, 1773, 100 Bostonians loosely disguised themselves, but this is because it was really a half-hearted attempt to disguise themselves. Think like a really bad costume party. And they're going to jump on there and smash the 342 chests of tea and dump them into the harbor. And as we know, becomes the Boston Tea Party. This in turn is going to cause the British to crack down on Boston. Now, more of that information will be in the next slideshow. So as it says right here, referring to tea as a badge of slavery, right? The Bostonians really went overboard, right? Hutchinson, chastised and disgusted, retreated to Britain, never to return. Remember, they're going to ransack his house, all that kind of stuff. And the British chose a perilous path that led to reprisals and bitterness and an escalating conflict. So this will be continued in lecture number 10.